As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Imagine a deal that was initially presented as a brilliant diplomatic and economic breakthrough, a deal that was supposed to strengthen ties between the closest neighbors, the United States and Canada. It was called an example of a strategic partnership where each side wins. But a few years later, it turned out that this story cost Washington billions of dollars in losses. Today, we will examine how an ordinary contract turned into a real financial bomb.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Why is this story so important? Because it shows how fragile even the strongest friendship between countries can be when huge amounts of money are at stake. The US and Canada are allies, NATO partners, and neighbors with the world's longest land border. They have been building trade and military relations for decades. But one contract became so unprofitable that its consequences are still being discussed by analysts in Washington and Ottawa. What was this document? At first glance, it was an ordinary deal, the kind of which dozens are signed every year. But this time, everything coincided: the ambitions of politicians, pressure from lobbyists, mistakes by analysts, and of course, geopolitical calculations. At the time of signing, it seemed that the US was gaining access to critical resources and technologies, while Canada was cementing its role as a key partner. But behind the scenes, disaster was brewing.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every US trade partner, and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
The secret is that the initial calculations were far from reality. Supply costs were rising, deadlines were being missed, and the bureaucratic machine in Washington was only making the situation worse. As a result, the US began to lose billions. This was a case where economics and politics were closely intertwined. Politicians in Congress tried to hush up the scandal, explaining that everything was under control. But the numbers told a different story. Newspapers in New York and Toronto ran headlines about rising costs, and independent experts calculated that American taxpayers had already overpaid more than would have cost to build a similar project domestically. The situation was made even more interesting by the fact that the US was in the midst of a heated debate over the budget at the time. President Joe Biden and his administration were facing criticism for every extra billion spent. And when this contract came to light, the opposition had the perfect argument. Money was not being spent on domestic needs, infrastructure, or healthcare, but was going into the pockets of foreign contractors. In Canada, on the contrary, this contract was presented as a victory for national industry and confirmation of the country's status as a serious player on the international stage.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
But the main thing is not even the losses themselves. The main thing is that this case has become a symbol, how one mistake in calculations, one underestimated condition, one political concession can have colossal consequences for an entire country. Today, experts refer to that contract as a financial bomb for good reason. It became a lesson for politicians and economists. Alliances do not guarantee fairness, and grandiose promises can result in billion-dollar failures. In this video, we will take a step-by-step look at how this happened, where the mistake was made, who ultimately won, and why American taxpayers are still paying the price for someone else's miscalculations. The story of this contract begins with both countries trying to strengthen their strategic partnership amid growing pressure from China and Russia. The US has long viewed Canada as a reliable neighbor, but also as a source of critically important resources. By 2020, a serious imbalance had emerged. Washington was increasingly talking about how American industry was too dependent on external supplies, whether rare earth metals, energy sources, or even components for weapons. At that point, the idea of striking a big deal with Canada seemed almost ideal. Ottawa was expected to provide stability, predictability, and a willingness to share resources. For Canada, this contract was a chance to cement its position in the North American hierarchy by showing that the country was capable of playing on equal terms with the world leader.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
The situation was further exacerbated by domestic political circumstances. There was heated debate in the US about the role of the state in the economy. President Joe Biden declared the need to transition to green energy, but in reality, the Pentagon and major corporations demanded stable access to traditional resources. This contradiction pushed the administration to make compromises, one of which resulted in the deal under discussion. In Canada, Justin Trudeau was under pressure from the opposition, which accused him of being overly focused on the US. Therefore, he needed a contract that would look profitable for Canadian taxpayers. At first glance, everything seemed perfect. The US received long-term supplies of rare earth metals and energy resources at a fixed price, while Canada received a guaranteed market and major investments in its infrastructure. Official press releases called the deal historic, emphasizing that it would be a bridge to a new decade of cooperation. Biden spoke of a victory for American workers, while Trudeau spoke of a new era of energy independence for North America. But behind the grand words lay a much more complicated picture. The actual figures already looked alarming at the signing stage. The contract included conditions that provided for automatic indexation of resource prices in the event of inflation. This meant that the US was effectively taking on the risk of any fluctuations in global markets. At the time, analysts warned that the global energy sector was on the verge of serious upheaval. But these warnings were ignored. Lobbyists from large corporations pressured Congress, arguing that the deal would save billions. In reality, it became a classic example of how political will can outweigh common sense. The Canadian side also played a special role. The Trudeau government managed to include several additional conditions in the contract that few people noticed. Among them were benefits for Canadian equipment manufacturers and priority for their companies in joint projects. On paper, this looked like strengthening the partnership, but in reality, it created a situation where the US became dependent on Canadian contractors. It was these points that later became the source of the greatest losses.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The background to the deal also goes back to geopolitics. After the annexation of Crimea and the start of the conflict in Ukraine, Washington sought to minimize its dependence on Russian resources. Canada was the ideal option, a reliable ally, rich in natural resources and willing to cooperate. But it was precisely this haste that played a cruel joke. Experts later noted that the White House felt at the time that there was no time to think and that the agreements needed to be finalized as soon as possible. As a result, many details were worked out in a hurry, without sufficient risk analysis. The second important part of the background story is related to the industrial lobby. Large American corporations working in the field of extraction and processing saw the contract as a threat to the positions, but instead of blocking the deal, they found a way to profit from it. Through a chain of subsidiaries and partner structures, they themselves became participants in the agreement, gaining access to Canadian deposits. This created a double dependency. The US seemed to be reducing risks, but in fact was strengthening the control of large corporations over critical resources. That is why the contract immediately after its signing became the subject of fierce debate in the expert community. Some called it an investment in the future, others called it the mistake of the decade. There were calls in Congress to revise the terms, but the political situation prevailed. The Biden administration could not afford to admit that its first major economic move toward Canada had been miscalculated. Thus, by the time the contract came into force, the US was already in an extremely vulnerable position. The background to this agreement shows that it was not just an economic decision, but the result of a whole complex of political compromises, international calculations, and corporate pressure. What was supposed to strengthen the alliance turned out to be a source of instability.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
In the months that followed, it became clear that those who had warned of possible problems were right. The cost of supplies began to rise rapidly, and dependence on Canadian contractors increased. And although both sides continued to officially refer to the contract as a symbol of partnership, behind the scenes in Washington, it was already being discussed as a time bomb. That is why this document is now referred to as a financial time bomb. It was laid not when the losses became apparent, but much earlier during the negotiations, when each side was trying to pull the blanket over itself. The US ended up trapped by its own expectations and political ambitions. Canada, taking advantage of the situation, managed to extract maximum benefit. When the contract finally came into force, it became clear that this was not just an agreement on the supply of raw materials and technology, but a multi-level structure where each line led to new obligations. It was based on three key areas: the supply of rare earth metals, expanding US access to Canadian energy resources, and joint projects in the military industry. At first glance, it seemed like a sound strategy combining several critical areas to strengthen economic and defense ties as much as possible. But the more experts delved into the details, the more questions arose. One of the most controversial points was the US's commitment to purchase certain volumes of metals from Canada, regardless of actual demand. The argument was that industry requires stability, but in essence, Washington took on the obligation to pay even for unnecessary shipments. In dynamic markets, this was extremely risky. American analysts later admitted that at the time of the discussion, they warned about the danger of fictitious demand, but political goals prevailed. The second part of the contract concerned energy. The US agreed to long-term oil and gas supplies with prices tied to a complex formula that took into account not only world prices but also domestic inflation in Canada. Thus, even if prices fell on the world market, Washington could still pay more than other countries. This scheme was presented as a unique mechanism to protect against fluctuations, but in reality it became a trap.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The third element of the agreement was the defense component. Canada insisted that its companies be given priority in supplying components for American military projects. This involved specific systems, including those related to the modernization of aviation and armored vehicles. It would seem that NATO allies should only welcome such cooperation. But the problem was that many of these industries were heavily influenced by unions and internal Canadian regulations, which made delivery times unpredictable. Taken together, these points created a fragile structure that, at best, could only function under perfectly stable conditions. But the world quickly showed that stability was not to be expected. The first disruptions began just a year later. One of the first warning signs was a delay in the delivery of metals needed for the American defense industry. Formally, Canada fulfilled the terms of the contract, but the shipments arrived late, and some of them did not meet the stated quality standards. Washington turned a blind eye to this because the contract did not provide for harsh sanctions for such violations. Moreover, any attempts to make claims were met with the force majeure clause, which gave the Canadian side ample opportunity to justify the delays. At the same time, the energy mechanism began to take effect. At the time the agreement was signed, world oil and gas prices were at their peak, and the fixed formula seemed advantageous. But when prices went down, it turned out that the US was overpaying by billions. Washington tried to explain this away as temporary difficulties, but independent experts had already calculated that the annual overpayments were comparable to the budget of entire federal programs. This looked particularly painful against the backdrop of Biden's promises to cut spending and reallocate funds to infrastructure and social programs.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The defense component also began to malfunction. American military factories depended on supplies from Canada, but strikes and bureaucracy caused delays. As a result, equipment production was delayed, contracts with the Pentagon were postponed, and this automatically increased costs. Within the US, voices began to be heard that the contract had effectively made the defense industry dependent on Canadian unions. All these failures were exacerbated by the political component. In Congress, the opposition demanded an investigation, claiming that the Biden administration was hiding the extent of the overpayments. Newspapers wrote about a trap contract, and analysts compared it to the most unsuccessful economic deals of recent decades. In Canada, however, the situation was diametrically opposite. Official Ottawa presented the contract as a success and explained the delays and difficulties by the complex international situation. A particularly striking example was the story of the supply of new materials for the aviation industry. The US was counting on regular shipments of certain alloys needed to modernize its fighter jets. But because one of the Canadian factories did not manage to complete the modernization of its equipment on time, deliveries were delayed for months. The American side could not quickly switch to other suppliers because the contract stipulated strict exclusivity conditions. As a result, the project to upgrade the aircraft fleet was delayed, and maintenance costs increased significantly. The situation with gas supplies proved to be no less painful. According to the formula, the price for the US increased in proportion to the growth in costs of Canadian companies, including even the costs of environmental programs. This seemed insignificant at the time of signing, but later became a source of billions in overpayments. It turned out that American taxpayers were effectively financing Canadian initiatives to reduce emissions and modernize pipelines. This sparked a storm of criticism within the US, especially among those who believed that the money should remain in the national economy.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
All of this added up to a picture where a single contract began to systematically undermine financial stability. The miscalculations and inflated expectations that experts had warned about became reality. Bureaucratic mechanisms prevented the situation from being quickly rectified, and political will prevented the mistakes from being acknowledged. Each new month brought further evidence that the agreement had become a real time bomb. Today, looking back, we can say that the failure was not due to any one factor, but to a combination of factors. The contract was too complex, too politicized, and too vulnerable to external circumstances. It became a symbol of how even allied relations can lead to disaster when ambitions and short-term goals come to the fore. The US found itself in the position of a country that signed a document for the sake of political victory, but paid too high a price for it. When the first real figures on payments became known, Washington found itself in an awkward position. Data published by the US Government Accountability Office showed that for every dollar invested in the contract, American taxpayers received less than 50 cents in real benefits. For an economy accustomed to tight control and predictable results, this was a disaster. In the first 2 years, losses were estimated at $18 billion, but after 3 years, the amount had nearly doubled. The press compared this failure to the largest military expenditures of recent decades, noting that the money could have been used to build more than 2,000 schools or modernize hundreds of kilometers of railways. The situation hit the military budget particularly hard. The Pentagon was forced to allocate additional funds to maintain projects tied to supplies from Canada. As a result, some domestic programs were cut, which sparked a barrage of criticism in Congress. Opposition senators openly stated that the Biden administration had made a strategic mistake by jeopardizing its own defense capabilities for the sake of an illusion of alliance. American military experts noted in closed reports that delays in the production of equipment due to this agreement could lead to a lag in strategic programs of at least 3 to 4 years. The financial consequences were evident not only in the figures, but also in public perception. American voters, accustomed to hearing about profitable deals, were shocked by the scale of the overpayments. Comparisons became popular on social media. Every taxpayer has already paid $1,000 for a contract from which we have no real return. In Toronto and Ottawa, however, the situation was different there. The media presented the story as proof of the strength of Canadian diplomacy. Economists noted an increase in investment in local businesses and the creation of new jobs directly related to the agreement. The gas formula story became a symbol of financial failure. According to calculations by independent researchers, in just one winter season, the US overpaid by more than $6 billion because the Canadian side was able to include internal costs for pipeline modernization in the calculation. And although this formally complied with the terms of the agreement, in essence, the Americans were financing someone else's infrastructure. This became a convenient argument for the opposition in Congress. Instead of repairing bridges in Michigan or building schools in Texas, money was being spent on Canadian pipes. Comparisons with alternatives looked even bleaker. A Washington-based think tank published a report stating that if the same amount had been invested in developing domestic production capacity in Nevada and Texas, the US would have been completely independent in its supply of key metals by 2025. But the contract closed this possibility, cementing the monopoly of Canadian suppliers. Economists called this strategic self-restraint, which is difficult to remedy even with political will.